Okay. Apart from the measures of central tendency, grade 12, I said I'm also going to talk to you about measures of spread. Under the measures of spread, we have the range, the quartiles, and the percentiles. Remember, under the measures of central tendency, we had the mean, the median, and the mode. Now, under the measures of spread, we have the range, the quartiles, and the percentiles. What do they mean, or how can we calculate the range, the quartiles, and the percentiles? Okay, let's first look at the range. The range is the difference between the highest and the lowest value in the data set. The range is the difference between the highest and the lowest values in the data set. And once you see the word difference in mathematical literacy, what comes into your mind is subtraction. Okay? So to calculate the range, the formula is range is equals to highest value minus lowest value. For an example, you are given that set of data, and if you look at that set of data, it is already arranged. So if you look at that set of data and you must calculate the range, so we need to substitute into that formula up there. Range is equals to highest value minus lowest value. So in this particular data set, the highest value is 183 minus the lowest value, which is 12. And then our range will be 171. Remember, the range is the difference between the highest and the lowest value in the data set. Okay, grade 12s. Moving on to the quartiles. Remember, in the measures of central tendency, when we were calculating or when we were determining the median, we said the median divides our data into two equal parts or into two equal groups. Now, let's look at the quartiles. The quartiles divide the data set into 4 equal groups, each containing 25% of the data. Remember Dr. Van Merwe when she was talking to you about fractions and percentages. She said the fraction, a quarter, which is 1 over 4, is in terms of percentages, it is 25%. Meaning if you are having your whole data set and you divide it into quarters, it means you divide it into 4 equal groups. And then each quarter is 25%. I hope you got that right. And I'm sure it's not for the first time, grade 12, that you hear about quartiles. Alright. In the quartiles, we have what you call the lower quartile or Q1. Q1 has 25% of the data. Okay? And then again, we have what you call middle quartile or Q2. But once you have already calculated the median, you already have Q2. So Q2 is where you find 50% of the data. Meaning Q2, just like the median, it divides our data into 2 equal groups. In the examination, especially the final examination, if they have requested you to calculate the median, they do not ask you to calculate Q2. I'm sure you are aware of that, grade 12s. In most question papers, they do not ask you to calculate Q2. Because if you have calculated the median, you already have Q2. That is why they do not ask you to calculate Q2. Because Q2 is our median. Okay? And lastly, we have our upper quartile or Q3. So Q3, that's where we find 75% of the data. Q1, we find 25% of the data. Q2 or the median, we find 50% of the data. And Q3, that's where we find 75% of the data. Let me just illustrate what I have spoken to you about in terms of the quartiles. Let's look at that. Let's assume that that is a loaf of bread. Okay? So, if you look at that, if you look at Q1, where Q1 is situated, below Q1, that will be the first group. And in that first group, that's where you find 25% of the data. Okay? And then, let's look at the median or Q2. Remember, the second group is between Q1 and Q2. But below Q2, that's where you find 50%, because under Q2, you have group 1 and group 2. And remember, grade 12s, each group has 25% of the data. So group 1 has 25, group 2 has 25, and both of them lie below Q2. That is why we say Q2, under Q2 you have 50% of the data. Okay? Now let's look at where Q3 or quartile 3 is situated. Under quartile 3, you find 3 groups. Group 1, group 2, and group 3. Remember, each group has 25% of the data. That is why we say under quartile 3 or Q3, that's where you find 75% of the data. Because it's 25, 25, and 25, which is 75. I'm sure this illustration makes sense. And then the last group as well will be 25% of the data, because we said quartiles divide our data into 4 equal groups. And each group will have 25% of the data. I'm sure that is right, grade 12s? Alright. Under the quartiles, we also have what we call interquartile range, or IQR. Interquartile range or IQR. The interquartile range is the difference between the upper quartile and the lower quartile values in a data set. Remember again, grade 12s, I said in mathematical literacy, once you hear the word difference, what should come into your mind will be subtraction. So the interquartile range or IQR is equals to the upper quartile or Q3. Remember, we call it upper quartile or Q3 minus lower quartile or Q1. Remember, it's either lower quartile or Q1. So IQR, which is interquartile range, is equals to Q3 minus Q1. So it's still working the same way as the range. It's only that this one we concentrate on the quartiles. Okay? Now, lastly, we have the percentiles, grade 12s. Remember, we said the quartiles divide our data into 4 equal groups. Now with the percentiles divide the data into 100 or more equal groupings. Remember, once you hear the word quartiles, you think of quarters. And once you hear the word percentiles, you think of percentage. So percentiles divide the data into 100 or more equal groupings. If I may have to illustrate that, grade 12s, let's look at that. We said Q1, and if you look at Q1, that is where you find also the 21st percentile. And under the 21st percentile, look, I've illustrated with white. Under the 21st percentile, that's where you find 25% of the data. Below the 25th percentile lies 25% of the data. Okay? Let's look at the 50th percentile, just below Q2. So once you have Q2, you already have the 50th percentile. So below the 50th percentile, I've marked that with black. Below the 50th percentile, that's where you find 50% of the data. Okay? And then the 71st percentile. If you have Q3, you already have the 71st percentile. And below the 71st percentile marker, I've marked that with red. Below the 71st percentile, that is where you find 75% of the data. And then 100% of the data which I've marked with purple is our whole set of data. The whole set of data contributes 100%. 21st percentile contributes 25% of the data. The 50th percentile has 50% of the data. The 71st percentile has 75% of the data. I'm sure this diagram, grade 12s, is actually illustrating what I am talking to you about. I hope it will make things make sense in terms of percentiles. I'm sure you got that right, grade 12s. Okay, moving on. Now we have a question. It says, determine the quartiles, meaning Q1, Q2, remember Q2 is also the median, and Q3, and the interquartile range for the following sets of data. You have set 1 and you have set 2. So for each set of data, you must determine Q1, Q2, and Q3, and also determine the interquartile range for each set of data. I'll give you again a few minutes for you to work on this, calculating the Q1, Q2, and Q3, and also the interquartile range. And then after that, we can look at the solutions.